one man turned my whole life upside down. Back then, I didn't even realize who was standing in front of me. I heard someone snarl, "I'm going to tear down everything you've put together," and then metal slammed into metal so hard the sound bounced around the whole parking lot. I just sat there in my old Honda Civic, completely still, staring into the rearview mirror while a cloud of steam drifted up from the fancy SUV that had plowed straight into my bumper. A tall guy in a pricey suit climbed out, wobbling a bit, a phone glued to his ear like he was still in the middle of some important call. No, I've got this handled," he was saying as his voice carried across the asphalt. "Just some nobody driving a junker." I pushed my door open and stepped out, taking a moment to adjust my glasses. There was something familiar about him, though I couldn't quite pin down from where. Clean-shaven, wearing that smug smile people get when they're used to walking into any place and assuming it belongs to them. "Sorry about that," he tossed out, with absolutely zero apology behind it. "Dylan Mercer." He stuck his hand out while still staring at his phone like I wasn't even worth looking at. "I'll have my insurance take care of everything." "You're okay, right?" he added. I shook his hand and couldn't help noticing the pricey watch and carefully manicured nails. "Adrian Holt," I told him. "I'm fine," I added. The second I said my name, his eyes sharpened a bit, just a tiny flicker, but I caught it. "Holt? Ha! That's not a name you hear every day." He tilted his head. "You wouldn't happen to know Claire Holt, would you? She works in real estate compliance." His question hit me like someone had dumped a bucket of cold water over my head. "Yeah, she's my wife," I managed to say. "No kidding?" Dylan's grin stretched even wider. "Small world." Then he added, almost too casually, "She looked incredible at that conference last week. That blue dress she wore really made her eyes pop." Something twisted deep in my chest, sharp and sudden. Claire had told me she'd been working late that Tuesday night. She didn't say a word about any conference. And there sure as hell hadn't been a blue dress involved. She'd left the house in her usual gray pantsuit, the same one she wore when she expected a long day. "The conference?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He nodded like it was nothing. "Yeah, the one at the Marriott downtown. Industry thing. She was the life of the whole damn party." Dylan laughed softly, then seemed to remember he was supposed to act professional. "Anyway, here." He handed me a business card. "Have your insurance guy reach out to mine?" I glanced down at the card. Dylan Poulter, Senior Risk Assessment Officer, Morrison & Associates. That was the same firm Claire worked for. "Right," I said. "I'll do that." He climbed back into his SUV and took off, leaving me standing there in the parking lot with a busted bumper, a business card, and a sick feeling growing in my gut that none of this was normal. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table filling out insurance forms while my mind kept replaying his words. Claire came in around 7, tossing her purse on the counter with the kind of casual rhythm she'd perfected over the years. "How was your day?" she asked, not bothering to look up as she flipped through a stack of mail. "Pretty interesting," I said. "Got rear-ended outside the university." "No," she blurted, finally glancing at me. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine. The guy Dylan Poulter said he knows you from work." Her hand hovered over an envelope for just a heartbeat before she answered. "Dylan, right. Yeah, he's in risk assessment. Did he at least give you his insurance info?" Claire asked. "He said he saw you at some conference last week." "Yeah, Tuesday night at the Marriott," I said. That made her finally look straight at me, her expression so calm and flat it almost felt rehearsed. "Conference?" she repeated. "Oh, that thing. Just a dull compliance meeting. Nothing worth talking about." "He also said you looked stunning in a blue dress," I added. Claire let out a laugh, but it had this stiff, hollow edge to it. "He's probably mixing me up with somebody else. You know how those work functions go, half the people blur together." With that, she headed upstairs, and a moment later I heard the water start running. She'd left her phone on the kitchen counter, something she almost never did. It buzzed, lighting up the dark glass with a text preview. KP, can't wait for next Thursday. I just stared at the screen until it dimmed back to black. Then I opened my laptop, hands a little shaky, and unknowingly started what would become the first line in a completely different kind of ledger. Over the next week, I paid attention in ways I hadn't bothered to in years. Claire had always been particular about how she looked, but now I noticed the extra effort she put into her makeup on specific mornings. The way she kept checking her phone, flipping it face down whenever I walked into the room. The slight shifts in her routine, more late nights at the office, quick errands that stretched into whole afternoons. I'd spent 15 years working as the assistant controller for the university, training myself to spot things most people never noticed. Numbers that didn't line up. Patterns that only appeared if you were patient enough to sift through the noise. And now I was turning that same slow, steady scrutiny toward my own life. I began with our finances, credit card bills, bank statements, loan documents. When I finally saw it, I felt my stomach twist. Claire had taken out a personal loan, $25,000, using both our names. And not 1 cent of it had ever shown up in our joint accounts. She'd also opened a credit card I didn't even know existed. When I finally dug up the statements, they painted an ugly picture, charges from pricey restaurants on nights she'd sworn she was stuck late at work. There were hotel rooms, too. Lingerie from boutiques she'd never once set foot in during our entire marriage. I sat alone in my home office at 2 a.m, the glow of spreadsheets lighting up the room, and felt something cold and heavy inch its way into my chest. The numbers spelled out a story I didn't want to accept, one I kept hoping I was misreading. But numbers don't make mistakes. Numbers don't lie. People do. I was still staring at the screen when Mira tapped lightly on the doorframe. Dad? You okay? She was 17, had Claire's sharp cheekbones but my quiet, thoughtful eyes. She'd always gravitated more toward her mom. Claire was the adventurous one, while I was the guy who helped with homework and made sure her lunch money actually ended up in her backpack. Just work stuff, I said, quickly minimizing the spreadsheet. What are you doing up? Couldn't sleep. She stepped inside a little. Mom's been acting weird lately, don't you think? I studied her face. Weird how? I don't know, happy, she said slowly. But, like, secretly happy. She hums when she thinks nobody's around, and she's been buying new clothes. Expensive ones. She shrugged. Maybe she got a promotion. Maybe, I said, though the word tasted heavy. The next morning, Claire told me she'd be working late again, big compliance review, she claimed. She kissed me on the cheek before heading out, and her lips tasted like a brand new lipstick I'd never seen before. Don't wait up, she added. The moment the door closed, I made a choice I wouldn't even have entertained a month earlier. I called in sick and followed her. Claire worked in a sleek glass tower downtown, the main office of Morrison & Associates, same place Dylan worked, of course, and a handful of other firms. I parked across the street and waited, watching the front entrance. At 11:47 a.m., she walked out of the building and headed 3 blocks over to a coffee shop. And there he was, Dylan Mercer, already sitting in a corner booth. I watched through the window as my wife slid into the seat across from him. She leaned in, smiling at something he said, laughing in a way I hadn't heard from her in a long time. Then Dylan reached across the table and laid his hand over hers. And she didn't move it. Didn't flinch. Didn't even pretend to pull away. They sat like that for exactly 43 minutes. I know because I timed it, watching from across the street like some ghost tethered to a life he no longer recognized. When they finally got up, Dylan placed his hand on the small of her back, gentle, familiar, practiced, and steered her toward the parking garage. I followed from a distance, keeping several cars between us as his SUV, now repaired since the day he hit me, slipped out of downtown and headed for the interstate. The Fairmont Hotel sat about 20 minutes outside the city. Upscale enough to feel important but understated enough that no one asked unnecessary questions. It catered to business travelers who preferred privacy over chandelier lighting. From the parking lot, I watched Claire and Dylan walk through the lobby doors together. They were absent for quite a while. That night, Claire came home at her usual late work time, dropped her bag on the counter, complained about the supposedly endless compliance review, and asked how my day had gone. "Quiet," I said. "Just worked on some budget projections." She nodded, told me she was exhausted, and headed upstairs to take a second shower, something that was becoming a pattern. I sat down at the kitchen table, opened my laptop, and created a new spreadsheet. It had nothing to do with the university. This one was my own private ledger and accounting of our marriage, with columns for lies told, trust eroded, and betrayal accumulating interest faster than any loan. Over the next several weeks, I settled into a grim routine. I'd call in sick, follow Claire, and document everything. Times. Places. How long she stayed. Who she met. Thursdays became their standard hotel afternoons. Tuesdays, they grabbed lunch before heading to Dylan's apartment, a sleek high-rise that cost more than I made in a year. And the more I followed, the more I learned about Dylan, details I doubted Claire had any clue about. For starters, he was married too. His wife lived in Boston, while he kept the Columbus apartment as his work crash pad. There was more. A lot more. He had gambling debts, big ones. I found that out by breaking into his personal email, which was protected by the kind of sloppy password a freshman would use. Dylan Mercer wasn't nearly as successful as he pretended to be. His apartment? Leased through his company. His car payments? 3 months past due. And the money he'd been borrowing from Claire? Yeah, that was my money. Our accounts. Our credit. He'd been using her to patch the holes left by his underground poker losses. The last piece of the puzzle dropped into place on a Thursday in October. I'd planted myself in the hotel bar, pretending to read a newspaper while sipping a lukewarm coffee, all while knowing Claire and Dylan were upstairs in their usual room. That's when a young woman rushed into the lobby, upset, out of breath, practically vibrating with anger. She marched straight to the front desk. "I'm looking for Dylan Mercer," she said, loud enough that I didn't have to pretend to read anymore. "I know he's here. He was supposed to meet me 2 hours ago." The clerk started mumbling something about privacy policies and confidentiality, but she cut him off like she'd heard it all before. "His wife hired me to find him," she snapped. "I'm a private investigator. So you can either help me, or I'll start knocking on every damn door in this place." I folded my newspaper and slipped out of the bar before things got messy. In the parking lot, I called Claire. "Hey, honey," I said when she picked up. She sounded a little breathless. "How's the compliance review going?" "You know, tedious," she said. "We'll probably be here for a few more hours." "That's too bad," I replied. "I was hoping we could do dinner, maybe tomorrow?" "I really need to focus on this," she said quickly. "Of course. Love you. Love you too." I ended the call and sat in my car, staring at the hotel entrance like it might suddenly explain everything to me. 23 years of marriage. 17 years since Mira came along. A mortgage, shared accounts, family vacations, school events, all the little pieces of a life we'd built brick by brick. And now it all felt like it was sitting on a foundation I'd never bothered to inspect until it was already collapsing. My phone buzzed. A text from Claire. "Review running even later than expected. Probably won't be home until after midnight." It was 4:17 p.m. That night, I didn't go home. Instead of going home, I ended up at a 24-hour diner on the edge of town. I slid into a corner booth and nursed cup after cup of coffee. The place smelled like frying bacon and old memories, and the waitress, a woman in her 50s with warm, tired eyes, kept refilling my mug without me having to say a word. Around 11, she finally paused beside me. "Rough day?" "You could say that," I murmured. "You want to talk about it?" she asked gently. I looked up at her, this complete stranger who had no stake in my life at all, and something inside me just cracked open. "I think my wife is having an affair," I said. The words drifted into the air like smoke, sharp, heavy, impossible to pull back in. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. That's rough." "The thing is," I told her, "I'm not even shocked." "Not really. Looking back, all the signs were there. I just refused to see them. She nodded, letting the silence sit with us for a moment. What are you gonna do? I stared down into my coffee, watching the reflection ripple. I honestly don't know. But even as I said it, I realized that wasn't the whole truth. I did know. Or at least, I knew the direction I was heading. I'm an accountant. My whole career has been about balance sheets, profit and loss statements, the logic of cause and effect. And Claire, she'd been creating a massive deficit in our marriage. Lies where there should have been honesty. Betrayal sitting like debt that kept compounding. And eventually, every ledger has to be balanced. The next morning, I walked into the university and handed in my resignation. Told my supervisor I was taking early retirement to explore consulting work. And honestly, that wasn't a complete lie. I was planning to consult very deeply on one very specific project. Once they cut off my university access, though, I had to get creative with how I kept watching Claire. So I took some of my retirement savings and rented a tiny office space across the street from her building. It wasn't glamorous, but it gave me a front row seat. I poured the rest of my retirement money into high-end camera gear and taught myself everything I could about digital tracking software. Then I turned my attention to Dylan, his routines, his finances, his history, studying him with the same steady precision I used to bring to the university budgets. And the more I learned, the clearer it became that Dylan Mercer wasn't some powerhouse executive. He was a collapsing house of cards pretending to be a skyscraper. The gambling debts were far worse than my early numbers had suggested. And then I found something even uglier: he'd been skimming from client accounts. Small amounts, hidden well, but not hidden well enough for someone with my eye for inconsistencies. That wasn't all. Dylan was running a slick expense account scam. He'd been charging personal purchases to corporate cards, padding reimbursement forms, manipulating receipts, stuff that would have slipped right past a casual glance, but not past me. But the crown jewel was what he'd been doing with a charity account Morrison and Associates administered. An entire embezzlement scheme, well designed, I'll give him that. Dylan funneled money into a shell company, let it sit there for exactly 31 days, then moved it again before eventually returning most of it to the original fund. The missing slices trickled into an offshore account he probably thought was invisible. I traced the whole setup in 6 hours. Once I had the full picture, I started planning my response. If Claire wanted to mess around with trust and betrayal, then I'd show her what that looked like when someone who actually understood systems decided to play. The first move was quiet. I created an anonymous email and sent a tip to Morrison and Associates' internal audit department. Nothing theatrical, just a nudge, suggesting they take a closer look at some unusual patterns in their expense reporting. I gave them just enough detail to make them curious, but not enough to point straight at Dylan. The second move got personal. I'd learned that Dylan's wife, Marina, up in Boston, was starting to question why her husband spent so much time in Columbus. Dylan kept feeding her stories about some big ongoing project that required a local apartment, but she clearly wasn't buying it anymore. So I called her office. Told her I was a colleague concerned about irregularities in some shared project files. Suggested, very gently, that she might want to check the credit card accounts Dylan had access to. I made sure to sound worried, not accusatory. Just a decent coworker trying to help a family. The third move went straight at Claire. I'd installed monitoring software on our home router, which meant every click she made online passed through me first. That's how I found out she'd been researching divorce lawyers and had already booked a consultation for the following week. She'd also been quietly siphoning money from our joint savings into her personal account. Small amounts, spaced out, but steady. A drip 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 of preparation. She wasn't planning to come clean. She was planning to escape. I ended up moving the money back where it belonged and then switched out every access code tied to the account. So when Claire tried to sneak in another transfer, she ran smack into a locked door. She didn't bring it up to me, not a word, which honestly told me more than any confession ever could. But the real masterstroke, at least in my mind, came when I reached out to the private investigator who'd been tailing Dylan on behalf of Dylan's wife. I introduced myself as a worried friend who'd noticed Dylan acting off lately, like something was brewing under the surface. I passed along a bit of the financial mess I'd uncovered, hinting that Dylan might be tangled up in something shady, something that could blow back on the folks around him. The investigator was surprisingly grateful. He'd only been hired to catch Dylan cheating, but evidence of fraud or embezzlement? That was worth far more to his client. 2 weeks later, Dylan's whole carefully crafted world started falling apart. What began as a simple expense review at Morrison & Associates suddenly ballooned into a full-blown investigation. And right on cue, Marina Mercer showed up in Columbus without warning, carrying stacks of credit card statements and bank records that made her husband look like a man living two entirely different lives. I watched everything unfold from the little office I'd rented across the street. I saw Dylan dragging himself in early and staying late, obviously juggling more problems than he could handle. And I saw Claire getting jumpier by the day, more calls, shorter tempers, constant tension hanging around her like smoke. The whole thing snapped on a Thursday. I planted myself in the hotel bar like I always did, but their meetup this time didn't even last half an hour. From clear across the lobby, I could tell they were going at it fast, sharp, no pretending left. Claire stormed out about 20 minutes in, cheeks burning red. And that night, she walked through our front door earlier than she had in weeks. "How was work?" I asked, glancing up from the book I was pretending to read. "Stressful," she said. "There's some kind of audit going on. Everyone's freaking out." "An audit? Wow. Sounds intense. But hey, it's probably nothing. You know how corporate places are, tons of drama over a few sheets of paper." But even as I said it, I could see the fear sitting right there behind her eyes. Claire wasn't clueless, she understood that companies didn't just launch audits for fun. I could tell she was starting to wonder what exactly Dylan had gotten himself into and how much of it might splash back onto her. Over the next few days, I watched her confidence slowly drain away piece by piece. She'd flinch every time her phone buzzed. She stayed late at the office, but I knew she wasn't sneaking off to see Dylan anymore. He was buried too deep in his own disaster to keep their affair going. The whole thing finally collapsed when Marina Mercer filed for divorce and, at the same time, reached out to the FBI with everything she suspected about her husband's finances. That Friday morning, Dylan was arrested right at work: embezzlement, wire fraud, tax evasion, the whole list. I stood at my office window and watched him being marched out in handcuffs like a man who'd suddenly discovered gravity. Claire wasn't anywhere around. She'd called in sick, said she had the flu. And that weekend, I decided it was time for my own move. I printed every bit of evidence I'd collected over the last 2 months: bank statements, snapshots from surveillance, printed emails, phone logs, hotel receipts. I laid everything out, organized and precise, the same way I used to assemble audit reports back in college. Then I asked Claire to sit down with me at the kitchen table and slid a manila folder across to her. "I know," I said. "Just that. Nothing else." Claire stared at the folder like it might bite. Her expression went through a full rotation: surprise, then denial, a moment of calculation, and finally this heavy, defeated acceptance. "How long have you known?" she asked. "Since the car accident. Dylan brought up seeing you in a blue dress at some conference you never bothered to mention." She opened the folder and thumbed through the pages. I watched her eyes track the photos, the receipts, the money trails. "This is a lot of work," she murmured. "I'm good at what I do," I said. "What do you want?" The question hung there, thick in the air. Truth was, I'd been turning it over in my head for weeks. What did I even want? An apology? The truth? My wife back? "I want you to understand what this has cost," I finally said. She lifted her eyes from the folder. "What I've cost," she repeated, like she couldn't quite believe I'd said it. "Yeah," I said. 23 years of marriage. Mira losing the respect she used to have for her mom. And me, well, you took whatever was left of my ability to trust anybody again." I shrugged. Dylan's career too, not that he didn't torch that on his own. His marriage. And eventually? Your job. My job? She shot back. I reached across the table, pulled the folder toward me, and flipped it open to a page I'd flagged. Morrison and Associates hasn't put it together yet, I said quietly, but they will. Internal auditors miss nothing. They're going to see you were covering his expense discrepancies, smoothing out compliance reports, and using company time and resources to meet up with him. The blood drained from her face. You can't prove that. Oh, I can prove plenty, I said. I can show you were meeting him when you were supposed to be working. I can show you were in his apartment on days you told me, and your boss, you were tied up in compliance meetings. I let that sink in before adding, and I can show you took out loans under forged documentation, money that went straight toward paying off Dylan's gambling problems. That last part was a stretch, but I'd learned something over the years: the strongest lies are the ones built on top of a solid truth. You're bluffing, she said, but her voice wavered, the confidence gone. I slipped a hand into my jacket pocket and took out my phone. A few swipes later, I found the photo I'd been saving for the right moment. There they were, Claire and Dylan, walking into his apartment building at 2:17 p.m. on a Tuesday. Clear as day. Time stamped. No room for debate. I've got hundreds like this, I said. Different places, different days. And every single one lines up with hours you were supposed to be at your desk. She stared at the screen, and I watched it hit her, the exact moment she understood just how thoroughly I'd boxed her in. What do you want? She whispered again. I want you to leave, I told her. Tonight. Take whatever fits in one suitcase and find somewhere else to sleep. I paused, letting the weight of it settle. And I want you to sign divorce papers giving me full custody of Mira, leaving you with exactly what you came into this marriage with 23 years ago. That's not fair, she said, her voice sharp and small at the same time. Fair? I let out a laugh, and even I was surprised at how cold it sounded coming out of me. You took money out of our joint accounts to cover your boyfriend's debts, I said. You lied to my face every single day for months. And on top of all that, you were gearing up to divorce me and walk away with half of everything I've spent my life building, including funds I didn't even realize you'd already skimmed off. I looked at her. So tell me, Claire, what part of this do you think is fair? She shut the folder and nudged it back toward me like it burned to the touch. I never wanted it to go this far, she murmured. But it did. And now I just need time to think. No, I said. You need to pack. That evening, she stuffed 2 suitcases with whatever clothes she could grab and headed out to stay with her sister across town. I carried her bags to the car, keeping the same polite, almost automatic courtesy I'd practiced for over 20 years of marriage. What are you going to tell Mira? She asked. The truth, I said. She's old enough to understand that choices come with consequences. Claire drove off, and I stood alone in the driveway, watching the red glow of her taillights fade into the dark. I felt emptied out, scraped raw, but also, in a strange way, relieved. The guessing was over. The pretending was finally done. About an hour later, Mira got home from a friend's place and immediately sensed something was off. Where's Mom? She asked. I guided her to the living room and walked her through the whole thing. I didn't show her the photos, she didn't need to see those, but I did show her the bank records, the transfers, the proof that her mother had been taking money out of our family's accounts to bankroll another man. She listened without saying a word. When I finished, she sat there quietly for a long moment. I knew something was wrong, she finally said. The way she was always checking her phone, the way she seemed happier when you weren't around. I'm sorry you had to learn about it like this, I told her. Are you two getting divorced? She asked. Yes. She hesitated, then asked softly, Can I stay with you? And right then, something tight and painful inside me eased just a little. Of course, I told Mira. And over the next few months, everything played out exactly the way I figured it would. Morrison and Associates wrapped up their internal investigation, and Claire was let go for violating company policy. They didn't press charges. I'd made sure the evidence pointed to her being gullible, not criminal, but her career in compliance was dead in the water. There's no coming back from that kind of stain. Dylan, on the other hand, wasn't so lucky. He took a plea deal, admitted to a whole list of charges, and ended up with 4 years in federal prison. His wife divorced him and headed back to Boston with their kids. His apartment got scooped up in asset forfeiture, and the fancy car he loved bragging about was hauled away on a tow truck. Claire eventually landed a job as a receptionist at a small insurance office, making maybe half of what she used to. She moved into a tiny studio and drove a beat-up sedan that had already lived a hard life before she got it. I heard about all this through mutual friends who acted like I should feel sorry for her. I didn't. The divorce went through in February. She signed everything without a fight. She knew pushing back would only drag more of her secrets into daylight, and she'd already lost too much. I kept the house, the savings, and custody of Mira. She got her personal belongings and half the money from selling her car, which barely covered her legal fees. Life settled into something steadier after that. I went back to work, taking a controller position at a smaller university across town. The salary was better, and it felt good working for a place that actually cared about accuracy and accountability. About 6 months after the divorce, Claire showed up at my place on a Saturday morning. Mira was out with a friend, and I was in the backyard working on the garden I'd picked up since everything ended. It had become something of a quiet refuge for me. "We need to talk," she said. I stood up, brushed the dirt off my hands, and turned to face her. She looked worn down. Thinner. Older. Her hair had more gray in it, and the clothes she wore were the kind you pick off clearance racks, not the polished outfits she used to buy. "About what?" I asked. "About what you did to Dylan," she said. Then, after a beat, and to me. I wiped my hands on a towel and took a long look at her face. "What I did?" I repeated. "You tore us apart," she said. "Piece by piece. Like we were just another problem you wanted to fix." "You did that yourselves," I told her. "All I did was make sure the fallout actually landed where it belonged." She shook her head, angry and wounded all at once. "Dylan lost everything, his job, his family, his freedom. And for what? Because you couldn't stand the thought of me being happy with someone else?" A cold heaviness dropped into my stomach. "Happy?" I asked. "Yes," she snapped. "Happy." For the first time in years I felt alive. Dylan made me feel wanted, and seen, and beautiful again. He made me feel like I mattered. And you just couldn't handle that. I stared at her, and for a brief second I saw the woman I married, the confident, bright girl I'd fallen in love with back in college. But that woman wasn't standing here now. This version of her had made every choice that led to this moment, and choices don't come without a bill to pay. "You funded that happiness with money you stole from our family," I said quietly. "You lied to me every day for months. You were preparing to walk out and leave me with nothing while you started fresh with cash siphoned from our joint accounts." "I would have paid it back somehow," she said. "With what?" I asked. "Dylan's embezzlement? His gambling wins?" Her expression collapsed, the fight draining out of her. "He wasn't a bad person. He made mistakes. He was stealing from a charity account, Claire," I said. "Money meant for sick kids. Whatever I did wrong in our marriage, I never stole from children who needed help. You didn't have to destroy him completely." I looked at her, this woman I'd shared more than 20 years with, and realized I didn't feel a single thing. No love, no anger, not even sadness. Just emptiness. Somewhere along the way, she had become someone I didn't recognize. Someone whose moral compass pointed in a direction I couldn't follow, or even understand. "I didn't destroy Dylan," I said. "All I did was make sure people finally saw him for who he really was. If that wrecked his life, that says a hell of a lot more about him than it does about me." Claire wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "What about us? What about Mira?" "Myra's fine," I told her. "She's doing well in school, she's got friends, and she's figured out something important: some people keep their promises, and some don't. She won't even pick up the phone when I call." "That's her decision," I said. "She's 17. Old enough to decide what kind of relationship she wants with her mother." Claire just stared at me for a long moment. "You've changed," she said quietly. "You used to be kind. I thought about that. I used to be naive, I said. There's a difference. I never meant to hurt you, she whispered. But you did, I said. And if I hadn't stepped in, you would have kept right on hurting me. That's the difference between us, Claire. When I finally saw who you turned into, I did something about it. She turned like she was ready to leave, then hesitated. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd just come to me? If you told me you knew about Dylan and asked me to end it? I actually thought about it for a moment. Would you have ended it? She paused. A long pause. I don't know. And there's your answer, I said. After she drove away, I sat out on the porch for a while, thinking about the whole conversation. I asked myself if I should feel guilty about Dylan sitting in federal prison, guilty about Claire working a job she hated, guilty about the whole domino chain I'd pushed over. But the truth was, I didn't feel guilty at all. I felt something settle inside me that I hadn't felt in months, a kind of quiet, steady peace I didn't realize I'd been starving for. Later that evening, Mira came home and caught me sitting out on the porch with a book in my hands. Mom stopped by earlier, she said as she dropped into the chair beside me. I know, I told her. She wanted to talk. What did she say? Mira asked. She thinks I was too hard on her, I said. Mira didn't answer right away. She just sat there, thinking. Then she looked at me. Do you think you were? I slid a finger into my book to mark the page and turned toward her. At 17, she was already giving glimpses of the woman she was growing into, sharp-minded, straightforward, not afraid to poke at the uncomfortable stuff. I think I was precise, I said. Your mom made certain choices, and I made sure those choices came with the proper consequences. Maybe somebody else would have handled it another way, but I did what made sense to me. Guess that's the accountant in me. I couldn't help but smile a little when I said it. Like an accountant, she repeated, leaning back in her chair. I'm glad you did it the way you did. If you'd just forgiven her and let her come right back, I think I'd always be waiting for the next time she'd lie to us. I reached over and gave my daughter's hand a gentle squeeze. You don't have to take a side in all this, I said. I'm not picking sides, she told me. I'm choosing to stay with the parent who actually tells me the truth. As the sun dipped behind the quiet houses on our street, I found myself thinking back over the past year. I'd lost a wife, sure, but I still had my daughter, and that mattered more than anything. My trust in people had taken a pretty serious hit, but at the same time, I'd come out of it with a much clearer sense of my own backbone. The naive part of me had been burned away, but in its place I'd picked up something far more useful, the realization that I could actually protect what was important to me. My phone buzzed then, snapping me out of the moment. It was a text from a number I didn't recognize. Hi, I'm Sarah from the book club. We met at the coffee shop last week. Would you like to have dinner sometime? I let my eyes rest on the message for a long beat, feeling a dull ache right behind my ribs. Then I quietly deleted it. I wasn't ready to step into anything like that. Maybe I never would be. Hard to say. For now, I had my daughter. I had my job. And I had a kind of steady peace in my life that I hadn't felt in a very long time. After everything that had played out, that was plenty. I opened my book again and settled back into my chair as the first stars began to show themselves overhead. And for the first time in months, I felt grounded, like I finally fit in my own life again.